Imagine two words, two ancient Greek words, nearly identical in every way. They share the same root, the same rhythm, the same theological gravity. The first word is homoousios. The second is homoiasios. Look at them closely. The only difference between these two terms is a single letter. 1. Iota, the smallest character in the Greek alphabet. Homoousios means same substance. Homoiousios means similar substance. And that microscopic difference, that one letter you could miss if you blinked while reading, became the most consequential spelling distinction in the entire history of Western civilization. It decided what billions of people would believe about the nature of God. It determined who would be called a faithful Christian and who would be branded a heretic, deserving of exile or worse. It shaped empires, destroyed communities, and buried entire traditions of thought that had thrived for generations. And the man who ultimately pushed for one word over the other did not understand the theology behind either of them, and openly said the whole debate was a waste of time. This is the story of the Council of Nicaea, but it is not the version you were likely told, if you were told anything at all. Most people who grew up in Christian traditions have heard the name. It floats somewhere in the background of church history, vaguely associated with something important that happened a long time ago. Perhaps you were told it was where the early church fathers came together in holy unity to affirm what Christians had always believed. Perhaps you were told the Holy Spirit guided those bishops to the truth. That version is comforting. It is also incomplete in ways that fundamentally change the meaning of the entire event, because the Council of Nicaea was not a church event. It was a political summit. It was convened not by a bishop or a pope or any religious authority. It was convened by a Roman emperor, held in his personal palace, funded entirely by imperial money, and attended by bishops who traveled on government transportation at government expense. The emperor opened the proceedings with a speech. He sat through the debates. He made his preferences known, and when it was over, the losers were not merely outvoted. They were exiled by the power of the Roman state. Now, if you are already sensing that this story goes deeper than anything you were taught in Sunday school, you are right, and it goes much deeper still. So before we continue, if this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you do not miss what comes next. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from right now and what time it is where you are. I am genuinely curious how far this conversation reaches, and if the title of this video made you stop scrolling, if something about it triggered that instinct that says there is more to the story than you were told, then share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because what we are about to uncover is not speculation. It is documented history that somehow never makes it from the seminary to the sanctuary. Now let us get back to the man who started it all. The emperor in question was Constantine I, and understanding his motivations is essential to understanding everything that followed. Constantine was not a theologian. He was not a lifelong believer who had spent years wrestling with questions about the divine nature of Christ. He was not even baptized as a Christian until he lay on his deathbed. Decades after the council that would define Christian orthodoxy for all of history. What Constantine was, with absolute clarity and singular focus, was a military ruler who had spent years fighting brutal civil wars to reunify a fractured empire. The Roman world he inherited was broken into competing territories ruled by rival emperors. Constantine clawed his way to the top, defeating one opponent after another, until by the year 324, he stood alone as the sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire. From the shores of Britain to the deserts of Syria, he had welded the political world back together through force, strategy, and sheer ruthlessness. He had no intention whatsoever of allowing a religious dispute to fracture what he had bled to unify. And then he turned his attention to Christianity and found exactly what he feared. The church was tearing itself apart over a question about the relationship between God, the Father, and Jesus the Son. A priest named Arius in Alexandria had raised what seemed like a perfectly logical point. If orthodox teaching said, "The Son was begotten of the Father," does begotten not imply a beginning? Is there not some sense in which the Father existed before the act of begetting? Arius concluded that the Son, while the first and greatest of all creation, was ultimately a created being, exalted beyond anything else in existence, but still not the same as the uncreated Creator. His bishop, Alexander, disagreed violently. The dispute escalated. Bishops across the eastern Mediterranean took sides. Excommunications flew in both directions. Christians were reportedly fighting in the streets. The religion Constantine had hoped would serve as social glue for his empire was instead becoming another crack in the foundation. Constantine responded the way a frustrated executive responds to a boardroom feud that threatens the quarterly earnings. He sent a letter to both Alexander and Arius. And this letter survives in the historical record. Historians can read it today, and what it reveals is genuinely remarkable. Constantine told both men they were fighting over trivial matters. He called the dispute insignificant. He described the questions at stake as trifling and unworthy of such fierce contention. Let that register. The question of whether Jesus Christ was of the same divine substance as God the Father, or merely of similar substance. The question that would define salvation and damnation for the next 17 centuries. The question embedded in the creed that billions would recite across generations. That question was dismissed by the man who would decide its outcome as trifling and not worth the argument. Think of it in modern terms. Imagine the chief executive of a massive corporation forced to mediate a dispute between two divisions, arguing over the fundamental mission of the company. The CEO does not understand the technical details. He does not care about the technical details. What he cares about is that the fighting is bad for business and bad for the unified image he has spent years constructing. So he picks a side, not because he has evaluated the merits, but because he needs the argument to end. He needs everyone to sign a document and move on. That is essentially what happened at Nicaea. Constantine convened the council in the year 325 at his palace in what is now modern Turkey. He issued the invitations. He selected the venue. He covered every expense. And when roughly 300 bishops gathered under his roof, Constantine did not sit quietly, waiting for divine guidance. He pushed for homoousios, for same substance, for the definitive answer that would end the controversy and let him get back to governing. The emperor who called the theology trifling chose the word that would become eternal truth. And if that does not make you reconsider what you were taught, then consider what happened next. Because if Nicaea was really the Holy Spirit settling a question for all time, what followed should have been peace. Instead, what followed was 55 years of chaos, reversal, and political warfare that makes the council itself look like merely the opening act. Before we can fully understand what Constantine did at Nicaea, we need to examine something most people never learn in any church. We need to look at the religious landscape that existed before that council. The standard version of Christian history gives you a clean, straight line. Jesus taught the apostles. The apostles taught the church. The church preserved the faith. And that faith arrived in your lap unchanged 2,000 years later, like a sacred relay baton, passed hand to hand, without ever touching the ground. That story is elegant and reassuring. Historians have also known for over a century that it is not what actually happened. Before Nicaea, there was no single Christianity. There were multiple competing versions, and each one claimed with absolute conviction that it represented the authentic teaching of Jesus. Scholars call it the diversity of early Christianity, and it is one of the most well-documented realities in the entire field of religious history. So here is a thought experiment. Imagine it is the year 200. You live somewhere in the Roman Empire, and you have decided to follow Christ. You discover that choosing Christianity is not a simple decision. It is more like arriving at a crossroads with 5 completely different roads, each promising to take you to the truth, each insisting the other 4 lead to destruction. These were not minor denominational squabbles over worship styles. These were fundamentally incompatible religions wearing the same name, different understandings of who Jesus was, different scriptures, different paths to salvation, and in some cases, entirely different gods. The first road belonged to the Ebionites, and their claim to authenticity is frankly uncomfortable for traditional Christianity. The Ebionites taught that Jesus was fully human, not God in flesh, not the second person of a Trinity, a man, the biological son of Joseph and Mary, a righteous Jewish teacher so devoted to God that he was adopted as a special son at his baptism, but a human being nonetheless. They followed Jewish law rigorously because Jesus himself had followed it. They kept kosher, observed the Sabbath, and rejected the Apostle Paul completely, viewing him as a fraud who hijacked a Jewish movement. Here is the detail that should stop you cold. The Ebionites traced their tradition directly to James, the biological brother of Jesus, the man who led the Jerusalem church after the crucifixion. James, who grew up in the same household, shared meals with Jesus, and knew his private teachings. If anyone had a credible claim to know what Jesus actually taught, it was his own brother, and that brother passed down a tradition saying Jesus was a man chosen by God, not God himself. That version was eventually declared heresy by people who had never met Jesus at all. The second road was even more radical. Marcion was a wealthy ship owner who arrived in Rome around the year 140 with a conclusion that struck him as obvious. He looked at the God of the Old Testament, the deity who drowned the world in a flood and commanded the slaughter of entire populations, and decided this violent creator could not possibly be the same being as the loving Father Jesus described. 2 gods. That was his answer. The creator of the flawed material world and the God of pure love Jesus came to reveal were entirely separate beings. Marcion discarded the entire Old Testament and assembled what may have been the first deliberate Christian canon, including only an edited Luke and 10 letters of Paul. His movement spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean. Tertullian wrote 5 entire books solely to dismantle his teachings. You do not dedicate 5 volumes to attacking a nobody. You attack a movement that is winning converts and threatening to become the dominant expression of the faith. The third road led into stranger territory. The Gnostics were not one group, but an entire constellation of movements sharing core convictions. They taught the physical world was the botched creation of a lesser, ignorant deity called the Demiurge. The material universe was a prison, and human souls were sparks of divine light trapped in flesh. Salvation had nothing to do with believing doctrines about a crucifixion. It was about gnosis, secret, transformative knowledge, revealing who you truly were and how your soul could escape its material cage. Jesus was not a sacrifice for sin, but a divine messenger sent to wake sleeping souls. The Gnostics produced their own scriptures: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth. texts hidden in the Egyptian desert and not rediscovered until 1945. In some regions, scholars argue Gnostic Christianity may have been the majority by the early 4th century. And then there was the road that triggered the crisis Constantine would try to solve. Arius and his followers agreed Jesus was divine, exalted, the first and greatest being God ever produced. But Arius insisted on a logical point he believed could not be ignored. If the Son was begotten of the Father, then there must have been some sense in which the Father existed before the begetting. The Son was magnificent and unique, but still, ultimately, a creation. There was, as Arius declared in a phrase that would echo for centuries, a time when the Son was not. This was not a lonely heretic on a street corner. Bishops across the eastern Mediterranean agreed with his reasoning. When the controversy erupted, it was faction against faction, with no clear winner in sight. Think about this landscape like the early days of the Internet. Multiple platforms. MySpace, Friendster, Facebook, each claiming to be the future of social connection. The one that survived was not necessarily the best product. It was the one that captured the right infrastructure at the right moment. Similarly, standing in the year 324 and surveying these 5 competing Christianities, you would have had no way to predict which road would become the highway and which would be bulldozed. Each had communities stretching back generations. Each had scriptures they considered authoritative. Each had teachers who traced their authority to the apostles. The version you inherited was one option among several, and its triumph required something that no theological argument alone could provide. It required an emperor with a political problem to solve, and the coercive machinery of the Roman state to enforce the solution. Now we arrive at the room where it happened. The year is 325. The location is the imperial palace at Nicaea, a city in what is now northwestern Turkey. And the man sitting at the head of the proceedings is not a priest or a theologian or anyone who has spent years studying the finer points of Christological doctrine. It is Constantine, Emperor of Rome, conqueror of rivals, unifier of a fractured empire, a man who understood power the way a surgeon understands a scalpel. He had called this meeting. He had chosen this location. He had paid for every bishop's travel, every meal, every night of lodging. Every person in that room owed their presence to imperial generosity, and every person in that room understood what that generosity implied. This was not a free academic symposium. This was a command performance, and the commander was watching. To understand why Constantine forced this gathering into existence, you have to appreciate what the Arian controversy looked like from the imperial throne. Constantine had not spent years bleeding on battlefields to watch his newly unified empire crack apart over a theological syllable. He needed social cohesion. He needed a state religion that could function as institutional cement, binding together dozens of provinces with different languages, cultures, and traditions. Christianity was supposed to be that cement. Instead, it was becoming another fault line. Bishops were publicly excommunicating one another. Arius had been condemned by his own bishop, Alexander, in Alexandria. But other bishops had welcomed Arius with open arms, declared him perfectly orthodox, and given him platforms to continue teaching. Accusations and counter-accusations flew across the empire in a blizzard of angry letters. According to some historical accounts, Christians were physically fighting in the streets. The emperor looked at this chaos and saw not a spiritual crisis, but a political emergency, and he responded accordingly. The council itself unfolded under conditions that any modern observer would immediately recognize as compromised. Picture the scene through the lens of contemporary institutional behavior. Imagine a government regulator convening a panel of industry experts to settle a major policy dispute. The regulator picks the venue, pays for everything, opens the conference with a speech, making his preferred outcome fairly clear, and then sits in the room watching every vote. Would you trust the independence of that panel? Would you consider the outcome a pure reflection of expert consensus? Or would you suspect that the presence of power in the room shaped what people felt comfortable saying? That is the dynamic historians describe at Nicaea. Constantine opened the proceedings with an address, emphasizing unity. He did not hide his desire for resolution. He participated in discussions. And when the theological arguments reached their climax, the emperor made his weight felt. He pushed for homoousios, same substance, the position that would declare Jesus fully and equally God alongside the Father. Not merely similar to or derived from the divine source, but identical in essence. The debates reportedly grew fierce. One famous legend, which historians note may be embellished, but which captures the atmosphere of the proceedings, claims that Nicholas of Myra, the bishop who would centuries later become the inspiration for Santa Claus, became so enraged during the arguments that he walked across the room and slapped Arius across the face. Whether that specific incident occurred is uncertain. What is documented is that careers hung in the balance. Imperial favor was the prize everyone was playing for, and imperial disfavor was the punishment everyone was trying to avoid. In that environment, under that pressure, with that audience of one watching from his elevated seat, the bishops voted. Of roughly 300 present, the overwhelming majority signed the resulting creed. Only about 20 initially hesitated, and under sustained pressure, in the direct presence of the emperor, all but 3 of those holdouts came around. Arius and 2 of his closest allies refused to sign. They were not simply excommunicated, which would have been a purely ecclesiastical punishment. They were exiled by imperial decree. Constantine did not merely endorse the theological conclusion. He enforced it with the coercive power of the Roman state. Arius was banished from Alexandria, removed from his supporters, stripped of any position of influence. His writings were ordered burned. Possessing his books became dangerous. Consider the psychology operating in that room. 300 men, most of whom owed their travel expenses to the emperor, gathered in the emperor's own palace, listening to the emperor's opening speech, watching the emperor observe every exchange, knowing the emperor had a preferred outcome, and then asked to vote freely on a matter of eternal theological truth. Modern social psychology has a term for what happens in these situations. It is called conformity under authority pressure. The famous experiments of Solomon Asch in the 1950s demonstrated that ordinary people will deny the evidence of their own eyes, will call a short line long and a long line short, simply because everyone else in the room appears to agree. Stanley Milgram's obedience studies showed that people will administer what they believe are painful electric shocks to strangers, simply because an authority figure in a lab coat tells them to continue. Now, magnify that pressure by orders of magnitude. The authority figure is not a man in a lab coat. He is the most powerful human being on the planet. The stakes are not an awkward moment in an experiment. They are your career, your freedom, your place in the community. The question is not which line is longer. The question is the nature of God Himself, and the vote is being watched. This is the origin of the Nicene Creed. That phrase you may have recited as a child. Of one substance with the Father. That is homoousios. That specific theological formulation was inserted into the foundational statement of Christian belief at a council convened by an emperor who called the underlying question trivial, funded by imperial taxes. held in an imperial residence, and settled by a vote taken under imperial observation. The dissenters were not debated into submission. They were exiled into silence, and the result was declared not a political compromise, but eternal, unchanging truth. The faith once delivered to the saints. The belief Christians had supposedly always held from the very beginning. That is a remarkable piece of narrative construction. And if the story ended here, it would already raise profound questions about how doctrine becomes dogma. But it does not end here, because what happened after Nicaea reveals something even more damaging to the idea that this council settled anything through divine guidance. The decades that followed would prove that eternal truth had an expiration date that depended entirely on which emperor happened to be sitting on the throne. If the Council of Nicaea was truly the Holy Spirit guiding the Church to eternal and settled truth, then the decades that followed should have been a story of peaceful consolidation. The question was answered. The creed was written. The bishops signed. The heretics were exiled. Orthodoxy should have marched forward in confident unity from that moment on. Instead, what actually happened was something closer to a theological civil war that lasted over half a century, with the supposedly settled truth being enforced, reversed, restored, and reversed again, depending entirely on which emperor held power at any given moment. The history of Christianity after Nicaea is one of the most damaging pieces of evidence against the idea that doctrine develops through divine guidance rather than political contingency. And it is a history that rarely makes it from the seminary classroom to the Sunday sermon. The reversals began almost immediately. Arius, the man exiled for refusing to sign the creed, was eventually recalled. Constantine himself, the emperor who had pushed for homoousios and enforced it with banishment, began softening his position toward the Arian side in the later years of his reign. The same ruler who had drawn the line between orthodoxy and heresy started wondering whether perhaps he had drawn it in the wrong place. This is not speculation. It is documented in the historical record. The man who manufactured the consensus at Nicaea began having second thoughts about his own product, and when Constantine died, the situation deteriorated rapidly. His son, Constantius II, took control of the Eastern Empire, and Constantius was not merely sympathetic to the Arian position. He actively championed it. Under his reign, the Nicene position went from being imperially enforced orthodoxy to being imperially opposed dissent. The same creed that had been backed by the throne was now being undermined by it. Bishops who had proudly championed homoousios at Nicaea suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of imperial favor. No figure illustrates this chaos more vividly than Athanasius of Alexandria. Athanasius was the great defender of Nicene orthodoxy, the man who had argued most forcefully against Arius at the council, the theologian who would later be celebrated as a saint and a pillar of the faith. If the traditional narrative were true, if orthodoxy was preserved by divine protection through an unbroken chain of faithful guardians, then Athanasius should have enjoyed a career of triumph and vindication. Instead, he was exiled 5 times by different emperors, 5 separate banishments over the course of his career. He spent approximately 17 years of his life on the run, hiding with monks in the Egyptian desert, fleeing from one refuge to another, watching from a distance as the theological position he had staked everything on lost ground to the very position he had fought against. The champion of eternal truth could not hold a single post for more than a few years at a stretch. His survival depended not on the rightness of his theology, but on the political winds of imperial succession. During these decades, the theological landscape resembled something like a weather system in constant turbulence. Councils met and issued statements that directly contradicted the conclusions of previous councils. Compromise formulas were drafted, attempting to split the difference between the Nicene and Arian positions. Semi-Arian theologies emerged, proposing that the Son was of similar substance to the Father rather than same substance or different substance, trying to find middle ground that could satisfy everyone, and ultimately satisfying no one. These compromise positions gained traction in certain regions, lost it in others, gained it again. When a new emperor took the throne and shifted patronage, the Christianity you inherited was not obviously winning during these decades. It was one faction among several, sometimes ascendant and sometimes barely surviving, its fortunes rising and falling, not with the quality of its arguments, but with the identity of the man wearing the imperial purple. If you had been alive in the year 350 or 360, standing in the middle of this chaos, you would have had absolutely no basis for predicting which version would ultimately be declared the true one. The outcome was genuinely uncertain and genuinely contingent on factors that had nothing to do with theology. What finally ended the war was not a better argument, or a sudden revelation, or a mass conversion driven by the obvious truth of one position over another. It was a new emperor with an iron commitment to one side and the willingness to use state violence to enforce it. Theodosius I became emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire in 379. And unlike his predecessors, who had oscillated between factions, Theodosius was unshakably committed to Nicene Christianity. In 380, he issued the Edict of Thessalonica, and this document deserves to be far more famous than it is. The edict did not merely express a preference. It did not politely recommend one theological position over another. It declared Nicene Christianity the only legal religion of the Roman Empire. The language is blunt and explicit. Those who follow the Nicene faith are Catholic Christians. Everyone else is a heretic. And heretics should expect both divine punishment and imperial retribution. Read that conjunction carefully. Divine punishment and imperial retribution. The emperor was claiming to speak for God and to enforce divine will with Roman soldiers. Theology had become statute. Disagreement had become crime. Theodosius was not bluffing. The years following the edict saw systematic suppression of everything that was not Nicene Christianity. Pagan temples were shuttered by imperial order across the empire. Pagan rituals were criminalized. The Olympic Games, that ancient tradition which had run continuously for over 1,000 years, which predated Alexander the Great and the Roman Republic, and nearly every institution still standing in the Mediterranean world, were abolished in 393 as pagan religious observances. Non-Nicene Christianity was targeted with equal force. Arian churches were seized by the state and handed to Nicene congregations. Arian clergy were stripped of their positions. The theological diversity that had characterized the Christian movement for 3 full centuries was being systematically dismantled and replaced by a single mandatory orthodoxy backed by the full coercive machinery of Roman imperial power. Think about this through the lens of modern regulatory theory. There is a concept called regulatory capture, where an industry gains control of the very agencies designed to oversee it, bending government power to serve private interests. What happened between 325 and 380 was something analogous, but even more profound. One faction within a diverse religious movement captured the enforcement apparatus of the most powerful state on earth and used it to eliminate all competitors. In roughly 55 years, Christianity transformed from a sprawling marketplace of incompatible theologies into a single imperially mandated faith. The version that survived was not the one with the best ideas or the strongest connection to the historical Jesus. It was the one that captured the emperor. and the emperor captured everything else. The victors did not simply win. They did something far more consequential than merely winning. They erased the evidence that there had ever been a contest. Once Nicene Christianity captured the enforcement machinery of the Roman state, it did not merely suppress its competitors. It rewrote the past to make its own triumph appear inevitable, natural, and divinely ordained. The losers were not just defeated. They were edited out of the narrative entirely, and in their place was inserted a fiction of seamless unity, stretching back to Jesus himself. Understanding how that erasure worked is the key to understanding why so many people grow up inside Christian institutions with a nagging sense that something about the story does not add up. The erasure was thorough and deliberate. Ebionite texts were destroyed or allowed to deteriorate until almost nothing survived. We know about Ebionite beliefs primarily through the attacks written against them by Orthodox authors, which is like trying to understand a defendant's case by reading only the prosecutor's closing argument. Marcionite communities were ground down under imperial pressure over generations. Their scriptures vanished. Their churches dissolved. Gnostic writings met a similar fate. Though here, the story takes a remarkable turn. Someone, we do not know who, gathered a collection of Gnostic texts, sealed them in a large clay jar, and buried them in the Egyptian desert near the town of Nag Hammadi. Those texts sat underground for 16 centuries and were not discovered until 1945, when a local farmer stumbled upon them while digging for fertilizer. 1,600 years of enforced silence. And then suddenly scholars had access to voices that the winners had tried to permanently mute. Even the memory of Arius was subjected to propaganda so crude it would be almost comical if its purpose were not so serious. According to the narrative that circulated among Orthodox communities, Arius died in a public latrine, his intestines rupturing from his body in a grotesque display of divine judgment. Historians recognize this for exactly what it is: the kind of tale winners construct to transform political victory into cosmic justice. Take a man who disagreed about one Greek letter and reimagine his death as proof that the universe itself sided against him. That is not history. That is public relations dressed in the language of divine retribution. What replaced the erased diversity was a narrative of unbroken continuity. One faith handed from Jesus to the apostles, to the bishops, to you. A single golden thread running through 20 centuries without a knot or a tangle. This narrative is not merely a story. It is a machine that generates authority. If the Church has always taught what it teaches now, if the faith you inherited is the faith of the apostles, preserved unchanged across millennia, then the institution delivering that faith holds a claim on your belief that is nearly impossible to challenge. How do you argue against 20 centuries of unbroken tradition? The answer is, you cannot. Not as long as you accept the premise. But the premise is the construction. The premise is what was built in the 4th century through councils and edicts and the systematic elimination of alternatives. Pull it apart, and the authority it generates begins to dissolve. One person saw this pattern with devastating clarity centuries before modern scholarship confirmed it. His name was Baruch Spinoza. He lived in Amsterdam in the 17th century, part of a Jewish community that had fled the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal. Spinoza began reading religious texts the way a historian would read any ancient document, searching for evidence of when they were composed, by whom, and how they had been revised over time. He noticed contradictions and seams. He noticed books attributed to Moses, described Moses' own death and burial, a rather impressive feat of authorship. He noticed that claims presented as timeless revelation bore unmistakable fingerprints of human construction. And unlike many who notice such things, Spinoza refused to stay quiet about what he found. His community excommunicated him at the age of 23. The sherem was total and permanent. No member of the community could speak with him, conduct business with him, or stand within 6 feet of his body. No one could read anything he had written or would ever write. His own family severed all contact completely. Christians across Europe banned his books with equal fury. Catholic and Protestant authorities alike condemned them. Someone attempted to assassinate him outside a synagogue. The blade tore through his coat, but missed his body. Spinoza kept that damaged coat for the rest of his life. A physical reminder of the price honest inquiry could exact. He spent his remaining years grinding optical lenses, precise and difficult labor that slowly filled his lungs with glass dust. He lived in rented rooms, moving when authorities pressured landlords into refusing him shelter. Writing philosophy almost no one read during his lifetime. He died at 44. Poor, largely isolated. The excommunication never lifted. But his method survived him, treating religious history as history, subject to the same scrutiny as any other human activity, became the foundation of modern biblical scholarship. It is the method used in every serious religious studies department in the world. It produces the complicated, nuanced version of Christian origins that exists in seminaries and academic libraries. And here is the final uncomfortable truth. That complicated version stays in academic settings. The simple version, the clean, unbroken line, from Jesus to you, goes out to congregations. Pastors learn the complicated version in seminary and teach the simple version on Sundays. The gap between what scholars know and what churchgoers hear is not an accident. It is a feature of the system. The complicated version threatens authority. The simple version creates it. Spinoza ground lenses until glass dust killed him, so that centuries later, people could examine these questions without a knife aimed at their throat. That fight took generations, and in some places it continues still. But the method endures. And the evidence it has uncovered is available to anyone willing to look. The story was managed. The history was too clean. And the instinct you may have felt sitting in those pews, that quiet suspicion that something was being filtered before it reached you, was not rebellion. It was pattern recognition. And the pattern is documented.